You can listen to the Canadian Gothic early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are listening to Canadian Gothic.
Hello, listeners. Tonight's story is going to take us to Suffield, Alberta, a community with a population just under 200 people. And it's safe to say each and every one of them knew Alfred Belyea and his wife, Deborah. The 72-year-old Alfred had been serving as the community's councilor for the past 6 years. He was a fixture at community events and was as reliable as they come. But on Thanksgiving weekend in 2021, something completely unexpected happened. Alf had vanished. And days later, a hand-drawn map would lead police to his body, which was found dismembered and in a garbage bin over 100 kilometers away. And as you'll hear, the story's even more complicated than that. In this episode of the Canadian Gothic, we're going to hear a love story that ends with confusion and horror. Our topic is the murder of Alfred Belyea and the case against the woman he devoted his life to, his wife of 50 years, Deborah Belyea.
Good evening. Thanks for being here. A week after he was reported missing, Cypress County councilor Alfred Belyea was found dead on Friday, and his wife has now been charged in his death. Alberta RCMP say Deborah Belyea has been charged with second-degree murder and causing an indignity to a human body. She is scheduled to appear in court on Monday. In a statement posted to Cypress County's Facebook page, Reeve Datta Hamilton says, quote, "I am incredibly shocked and saddened to learn of Elf's passing," adding everyone at the county will miss his kind spirit and devotion to his work. Belyea has served on the county's council since 2015. RCMP are asking anyone with information regarding the incident to come forward.
Suffield, Alberta sits on a small, flat patch of prairie land about 40 kilometers west of Medicine Hat. With a population hovering around 190, it's the kind of place where people wave at every vehicle, and the rhythm of life is largely guided by the weather forecast. Alfred Belyea, who everyone called Alf, was a fixture in this community. He and his wife Deborah had retired to Suffield from another small village in the neighboring province of British Columbia, where Alfred had served as the manager of public works. But don't let the word retirement fool you. Slowing down didn't seem to be in 70-year-old Alfred's blood. Not long after settling in Suffield, he continued to embrace public service and successfully ran for the county's councillor position. Council members described him as fair, measured, and respectful. Community members used terms such as kind-hearted, easygoing, and reliable. But to those close to Alf, he was above all a family man, deeply devoted to his wife Deborah, their 3 daughters, and their many grandchildren. Now let's spend a bit of time on Alf's wife Deborah. Unlike Alf, she was much more reserved and didn't wear her 70 years so well. She was a woman worn down by poor health and relied on an oxygen tank that she wheeled with her from room to room for breathing. Friends said she rarely left the house and tired easily, but she was kind in conversation and was unfailingly polite. From the outside, the Belyeas were a picture of commitment and stability, grounded by family and community, and with a healthy respect for hard work. But as you're soon going to hear, everything that held them together was about to fall apart. And it would happen over the course of Thanksgiving long weekend in 2021. We'll start at the beginning. Alfred spent the Thursday before the weekend golfing with some friends. It was 3 fellow councillors. It's said that their spirits were high that day. The group went from hole to hole laughing and discussing community projects and ended the day by making plans to shoot another round of golf together on Monday. But when tea time came on Monday, Alfred didn't show up, and that wasn't like him. But it wasn't just his golf buddies wondering where Alfred was. His daughters back in British Columbia had also been trying to reach him over the weekend. Alf had daily phone calls with his daughters, and the calls were almost something you could set your watch to. But they hadn't been able to reach him the entire weekend. Their mother Deborah, of course, was at home. Given her health, she wasn't prone to venturing very far from her phone. When asked, she told her daughters that Alf had left early Friday morning to meet an acquaintance about some land, and he hadn't returned. Somewhat concerned, she'd just assumed he'd taken off for a while. But much more concerned were her daughters, who pressed her to call police. But she hesitated. It wasn't until Monday, October 11th, 4 days after he was last seen, and a couple hours after his golf buddies were scratching their heads at the first hole, that Deborah finally phoned the RCMP to report her husband missing. The responding officers were met by a fragile and emotional Deborah, who cried through much of the interview, her sobs of course accompanied by the hissing of the oxygen tank she relied on for breath. The story she told the officers was quite simple, and it was in line with what she'd been telling her daughters. When she woke on Friday morning, Alf was gone. She assumed he went to meet with an acquaintance that he'd been considering buying land from, but she had no explanation for why he hadn't returned. And this was immediately taken seriously. A 72-year-old man who is as dependable as they come, missing for 4 days after leaving to see to a vague business deal? It doesn't take an RCMP investigation to tell you something wasn't right here. And the officer knew it, and the daughters knew it. To oversee what was happening, the couple's eldest daughter, Trina Belyea, boarded a plane for British Columbia to come help with the search and to care for her mother. But what she was going to get involved in is nothing like she ever would have imagined. Before we get to that, let's take a short break, as things are really going to pick up when Trina arrives in Suffield. But we'll get to that after this break. Trina arrived in Suffield on Wednesday, October 13th, and it was obvious she was needed there. Her mother, Deborah, was exhausted, emotional, and with near crippling anxiety. With her mother and the oxygen tank by her side, they spent their days fielding calls from police, family, and community members, and they spent their nights lying half awake in the quiet house. It was during the second sleepless night that the investigation into Alfred's disappearance would be blown wide open, and it would happen in the most unexpected way. In the early morning hours of Friday, October 15th, Trina and her mother were both having trouble sleeping, so they decided to sit together in the living room. At some point later, Trina drifted off to sleep in the recliner, and at some point even later than that, her eyes briefly peeled open just wide enough to see her mother seated at the kitchen table. The hiss of the oxygen tank was now accompanied by a gentle scratching. Deborah was at the table with her head down, scribbling something onto paper. It wasn't the kind of scene that would wake you up, and as such, Trina drifted back into sleep. When she next woke, she was alone in the living room. Deborah must have put herself back to bed, but she left something behind. Sitting on the table was what her mother had been working on. It was a letter addressed to Trina and her sisters, and it began with love. I love you all so much. You've all turned out to be lovely, loving girls. We are so proud, it starts. I love Alfred with all of my being, and I always have, so please do not hate me. The note then turns to describing loneliness and despair. It says, I needed to be loved and wanted. I needed your dad to hold me, but he never did anymore. I have days where I sit here all by myself and wish I was either with everyone or was dead. The letter then wanders somewhere between an apology and some confusion. It says, I don't remember what happened, but I will eventually, I'm sure. I didn't mean for this to happen. I don't even know for sure if I did anything, but I want your dad home. I love him. I was such a burden to your dad. No wonder he didn't like me. At the end of the letter was something altogether different. Deborah ended with a crudely drawn map. It showed a route from Suffield across the prairies east into Saskatchewan and ending near Piapot, a tiny community the family once called home. Although it seemed impossible, Trina knew exactly what this was, and she didn't wait. She called the investigator on her father's case, and within a couple hours, RCMP officers were following the map's directions. 5 minutes south of Piapot, among the ruins of an abandoned farm, police found what they were looking for. In the tall grass near an outbuilding was a green garbage bin lying on its side. The smell of death was heavy around the bin, even in the cold morning air. On the ground were 2 A&W drink cups, a blood-stained roll of duct tape, and a tied-up garbage bag that was leaking blood and some kind of organic matter. All of this gave more than a subtle hint of the horrors waiting for them inside the bin. When they opened it, they found wrapped in blankets, garbage bags, rope, and duct tape, the majority of 72-year-old Alfred's body. I say majority as his arms were missing. In fact, they were never recovered. Later testing confirmed everything police already suspected. The garbage bin was a match for the ones found at the couple's home in Suffield. Alfred's blood was found both in the bin and in the trunk of Deborah's Volkswagen Golf. Even the rope and a rug found with his body had a match in the couple's home. And it gets even worse for Deborah. Shortly after Alf went missing, she visited a friend and gave her a garbage bag, asking her to throw it away. Several days later, when curiosity got the better of her, her friend opened it and found bloody women's clothing, more rags, and a roll of paper towel, all stained in blood. Realizing what it might be, she called the police. So to put it simply, it was the kind of case that investigators would call airtight. But the problem was, it didn't make sense. Deborah was frail and dependent on oxygen and struggled to even lift small items. How could she have done all this? Kill her husband, cut his arms off, and transport him more than 150 kilometers away? That was the mystery here. Not who killed him, but how. On October 15th, the same day police found Alf's body, Deborah Belyea was arrested at her home in Suffield. The small town was stunned. Neighbors spoke of disbelief. Words like shocking, mind-blowing, and sad were repeated, and at Cypress County Hall, flags were lowered to half-mast. To imagine that man's life ending this way, and at the hands of his wife, it all felt impossible. But the evidence left no question. Whatever had happened in the home, and it was violent. We can get a hint of how it went down by looking at the toxicology results, which revealed a cocktail of drugs in Alf's system. Morphine, codeine, and several others. It was more than enough to cause deep drowsiness and likely unconsciousness. And as far as the cause of death, Alf had been stabbed 4 times, wounds that punctured his heart, a lung, and his jugular vein, each of which on their own could have been fatal. But despite all of the evidence against her, Deborah pleaded not guilty to the charges of second-degree murder and interference with human remains. So this is going to go to trial. It took more than 2 years for it to get there, but when it did, in January of 2024, over a span of 7 days, prosecutors called 18 witnesses who collectively painted a picture of opportunity and evidence. There was no forced entry, there was no intruder, no sign of a struggle, and all of the evidence pointed directly to Deborah herself. But the defense argued that her physical limitations made the crime impossible. Her lawyer, Catherine Bayek, pointed out that Deborah could barely lift her knitting bag, let alone dismember her husband and haul his body away in a garbage bin. And as far as the letter and that map, they claimed that they were the ramblings of a confused woman who had dreamt of her old home in Piapot, and it was all just a coincidence, not a confession. But for the presiding judge, Justice Miller, the prosecution's case was too strong. He referred to the evidence as a tight circle that left no rational or reasonable scenario other than Deborah's guilt. He found that Deborah stabbed her husband at least 4 times in the home, dismembered him, and did, in fact, transport his remains to Saskatchewan. He noted that the cleaning, the missing rug, the use of bleach in the home, and the bloody bag of clothing given to a friend were all proof of Deborah's attempt to erase what she had done. When the verdict of guilty was read, over the hissing sound of her oxygen tank, Deborah wept uncontrollably. When the court reconvened for sentencing, then 71-year-old Deborah received a mandatory life sentence for second-degree murder with no chance of parole for 12 years. She also received a concurrent 3-year sentence for indignity to a human body. During sentencing, her 3 daughters each read victim impact statements. They spoke of their grief, the anxiety that haunts their day, and the strange fracture between love for their mother and the loss of their father. Despite the horror of what she had done, the daughters all stood by their mother, specifically asking that she be imprisoned in British Columbia so that they could more easily visit her. In an atypical moment, before Deborah was led away from the courtroom, Justice Miller allowed her daughter, Trina, to embrace her. 2 years after exchanging the letter that changed everything, they held each other and sobbed together for several minutes in a packed courtroom. When Deborah Belyea becomes eligible for parole, she'll be in her early 80s, and given her health, the case may never find its way in front of a parole board. But without that eventual hearing, we may never know what really happened here. That part of the story remains a bit of a mystery. There was no clear motive, there was no explosion of rage or financial dispute, just isolation, illness, and the slow unraveling of a marriage that was hidden behind closed doors. Deborah's letter remains the closest thing we have to an explanation. "I love Alf with all my being. I don't remember what happened," she wrote. I want to thank you for joining me here on the Canadian Gothic. I'd like to send my deepest condolences to everyone affected by this tragic story. It seems the world needs more people like Alfred Belyea, a family man committed to public service, but to have him taken in such a horrific and complicated way just seems so unfair. Now, with that said, I'm going to start wrapping up this episode, but before I do, let me end with some thanks. First, a big thanks to Linz from the Dystopian Simulation podcast for providing my intro and outro voiceovers, and Monty Datta, who provides the music for this show. Then, lastly, but most importantly, a massive thank you goes out to each and every one of you listening, as without your interest and your support, the Canadian Gothic would be as pointless as it would be impossible. Now, on the topic of support, let me thank the newest subscribers to the premium feed. Vanessa, Nick, and Jeremy, thank you for going premium. If anyone else would like to support the show, you can help us out here in a variety of ways. First of all, a premium feed subscription costs just a couple dollars a month, and that money will fund the creation of new episodes. But the premium feed will also give you those episodes 2 days early, give them to you ad-free, and give you access to a back catalog of episodes. If that sounds like something you're interested in, you can go premium at thecanadiangothic.com/subscribe. And even if you don't want to go premium, you can still support the show by sharing this episode on social media and letting all your like-minded friends know why they should listen. Your support is very much appreciated. Now, until next time, let me remind you to take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.
Thank you for listening to Canadian Gothic.
Deborah Belyea and her daughters were in tears as Justice Dallas Miller delivered his guilty verdict. Miller ruled the victim died from 4 stab wounds and that Belyea intended to kill him. Miller spent over an hour and a half summarizing the evidence and testimony from the 7-day trial that took place earlier this month. A note Belyea wrote with a map to her husband's body, the forensic evidence placing her at both crime scenes, and a bag of bloody clothes she gave her friend were all highlighted. At the end, he said the prosecution proved beyond a reasonable doubt Belyea committed the second-degree murder and indignity to a dead body.
Eli, you had a chance to speak with the prosecution after all was said and done. What did they say?
Over a 7-day trial, the Crown called over a dozen witnesses. The defense did not call any to speak to Deborah Belyea's story and not guilty plea. It was only through witnesses the court heard that Belyea maintained she did not leave her home over the Thanksgiving weekend in 2021. Despite overwhelming evidence presented by the Crown, lead prosecutor Jace Cowan says it's still not a walk in the park.